much for joining me today. We are continuing our study of 1st and 2nd Kings, and we're going to be taking a look at 1 Kings 12 through 14 today. Let's pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you that we get to continue to open your word together. I pray that as we do so, that you will illuminate our hearts with your word and what you have to say to us, God, that we will have ears to hear your voice, God. We love you and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week we left things with Solomon, and Solomon passed away at the end of our passage last week, but we left things with the promise that the kingdom was going to be ripped away from Solomon's son based on Solomon's sin, that he did not follow God as David had. Instead, he allowed his wives to turn his heart away from God, his foreign wives who had their own forms of worship and wanted to hold on to those. They eventually turned his heart away from God. So today we're going to pick up this story in chapter 12, and our passage for the week is from chapter 12, and it's that first section. It starts in verse 6 and goes through 19. But we're going to talk about the section from 12 to 14 because that is the section that kind of goes with our curriculums section, because we'll pick up again next week later in 1 Kings. So today we're going to talk about those three chapters. We're going to zero in on Rehoboam here at the beginning, and then we'll talk through some other pieces because there's some very interesting things that happen. So in this section of 1 Kings, we're going to get this split. So we know it's coming from what we heard last week, what we learned last week. We know that Jeroboam is going to be the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And we know it's going to be taken away from Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So let's go ahead and read and look at how that happens. I'm in chapter 12, and I'm going to read from verses 1 all the way to 19. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days, and then come back to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. They replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor. But all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So the kingdom is now divided. We had 3 kings that were unified, a unified kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. And then here with Rehoboam, it couldn't even last one generation beyond. And Rehoboam effectively divides the kingdom. Now, I have to admit, when I read this passage, I just kind of scratch my head because the advice just sounds terrible. But we'll get to the advice in a minute. I wanted to point out a few other things before we get there. But here we go in verses 1 and 2. So Rehoboam went to Shechem, and Shechem was about 40 miles north of Jerusalem. It would have been in the hills of the tribe of Ephraim, so the hills of Ephraim. And so he went there because Israel had gone there to make him king. And so he went to basically establish the fact that he was king over all of Israel. And that's where he was. And so the people come to him. And so when we hear this, the whole assembly of Israel, he said the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam. So we can hear representatives from the different tribes. And they went to negotiate for a lighter load. And so here we see this conscripted labor. So the forced labor, not the slave labor, the forced labor from of the people of Israel for all of Solomon's building projects. We see that coming back into play here. The people are asking for a lighter yoke. They are wanting to renegotiate how this relationship between king and people works. They don't want to have to do all of that labor in maybe the same way. I don't know if they're saying we don't want to do any of it, but they're definitely saying, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but lighten this harsh labor and the heavy yoke, and we're going to serve you. So saying, hey, if you will meet us and do this for us, we will serve you. And so Rehoboam responds by saying, well, give me some time to think about it. And so he asks the elders who had served his father and said, how would you advise me to respond? And so they say, hey, you should listen. If you say that you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they really will serve you. They will be your people and they will love you. And I mean, they didn't say that, but that's basically what they're saying. If you're a servant, they are always going to serve you. They're going to want to follow you. But he rejected that advice and turned to the young men that he had grown up with. And so we need to remember, we're not talking about like teenagers or children. We're talking about grown men that he had grown up with. We look over in chapter 14 and verse 21. We find out that Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became the king. And he was not really young. So these men who were the young men, they were just younger than the elders and they had not served Solomon. And so their response is really terrible, very arrogant and selfish in a lot of ways. And they basically say, and Rehoboam seems to have already kind of decided he wanted to follow their advice even before he had seen it. And they respond with, I'm stronger than my father. I'm more of a man than you should say, I'm more of a man than my father, and I will lay a heavier yoke on you, and I'm going to scourge you with scorpions, not just whips. I just really struggle with seeing how anybody could think that's good advice. Like, people hearing that are not going to want to follow you. But, I'm not a king in the ancient Near East, so what do I know? Maybe this is the way you get followers. But here we have them responding that way. And it's interesting when you look at how Rehoboam approaches the elders versus how he approaches the young men. He approaches the elders and saying, how would you advise me to answer the people? But then when he talks to his friends, he says, what's your advice? How should we answer them? They said, lighten the yoke your father put on us. I don't even know if he gave them the full scope of what they were asking. But I suspect it wouldn't have mattered. They would have responded the same way. So we already know, because we already read it, how Rehoboam responds. He leaves out the I'm stronger than my father, but he definitely says the whole, I'm going to scourge you with scorpions bit. And did he mean, whips that had, spikes on them? Maybe? I don't know. I've never seen anybody try to whip people with scorpions, but I also wasn't alive back then, so maybe they did that. But the king didn't listen to the people. And so we find out that Rehoboam did not have a listening heart. And remember what we read at the beginning in chapter 3, King Solomon had a listening heart. Whenever he prayed and was asking God for wisdom, he wanted to have a heart of wisdom. And so we learn that Rehoboam did not. He couldn't even listen to the people. And so the people of Israel rebel. And they say, well, we don't need to be a part of this. We can do our own thing. And so they rebel, and they, we kept reading in verse 20, they crown Jeroboam king when they find out that he's come back from Egypt. And only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. And one of the things that I was struck by when I was reading this passage, especially when I found out looked at where Shechem was, is I was reminded of the proximity between the north and the south. And you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And I don't know, in my mind, for some reason, I always was thinking, oh, there's this like space in between. That doesn't make sense logically, but they really were close by. I mean, 40 miles from Shechem to Jerusalem. And so where all this is happening is only 40 miles from where the temple is, and where the palace is, and where the seat of government is. And they rebelled. They could not come together. But then Rehoboam is getting ready. He wants to get all of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And it says he's ready to go to war against Israel. But a prophet says, don't do this. Do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. And they're prevented from going to war with their brothers. And then chapter 12 is going to go on, and Jeroboam has a short memory because it's very interesting. So this passage is fascinating to me. So Jeroboam starts off here, and he is just so anxious that the people are not going to stay following him. And he doesn't want them to return to King Rehoboam. He's afraid that if they go down there to the temple in Jerusalem, that they're going to decide they want to follow Rehoboam again. He is no longer going to be king. So he seeks some advice, but we're not told from who. And instead, he decides, I'm going to make 2 golden calves. So he must not know his history very well, because the last time they did that, it didn't go very well. So if you want to read the story, it's actually very fascinating to read in Exodus. If you look at Exodus 32, that's where you'll find the story of the golden calf at Mount Sinai. And it's fascinating because he says some of the very same things that Aaron says whenever the calf comes and they make the calf to worship. So Jeroboam makes 2 golden calves, and he says, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. So I just want to read this. So if we look over in Exodus 32, really quickly, it's just fascinating to me how this comes up again. Of all the things that he could decide, golden calves, really? Definitely didn't go well when they did it the first time. So if we look at Exodus 32, look at verse 4. It says, Aaron took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. And then it's kind of eerie how similar it is there. So Jeroboam sets one in Bethel and the other in Dan. And so Dan would have been up in the north and Bethel would have been in the south. And this was an attempt by Jeroboam to keep the people from going to Jerusalem to worship. Now, I am sure there are still people who went to the temple to worship and did not follow Jeroboam. But the bulk of the people followed Jeroboam. And he also built shrines and high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, not even those outside of the Levites. And he created a festival, so a festival that was in the wrong month to worship these gods, and went and worshipped them and offered sacrifices. Yeah, it's just really staggering when you read it. It's almost as if he was moving backwards in Israel's history. So going back to the golden calf from Exodus and moving backwards to having all the shrines and the high places they just had gotten rid of, even though Solomon put some out for his wives. But it's almost as moving backwards instead of forwards. And it's going to keep coming back, and it's just really going to plague these northern tribes. And Judah has its own troubles. And so we see in chapter 13, there is this interesting story about a man of God from Judah. He goes and proclaims against the altar at Bethel that it is going to be completely desecrated. But 3 centuries in the future with King Josiah. And that's interesting because that's in verse 2. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. And that story will come later. And maybe we'll get to talk about it a little bit. But he goes and proclaims this. And then there's this very interesting story about this prophet as he's supposed to go home, and he's not supposed to eat or drink anything. He's supposed to go home a different way. And then there's this other prophet in Bethel who comes and gets him and deceives him into coming back to his house and eating and drinking. And then this prophet from Bethel prophesies against this man of God from Judah and says, hey, you did the wrong thing, but he just deceived him. It's very interesting. You should read it because it's a very interesting story. But as I was reading it and reading this commentary, because it's always confounding me, so I'm like, this is just a weird story. Why this prophet from Bethel is clearly deceiving the one from Judah. And yes, he should not have turned aside and gone back with the guy, but it's just so crazy. Because then he gets eaten by a lion, the original prophet who proclaimed against the altar. And the lion just stands there next to the body. And then the prophet from Bethel goes and gets the body and then buries him in Bethel. And then when he dies, he wants to be buried with this prophet. It's a bizarre story to me. I mean, it's definitely different. But it's interesting because as we read, one of the commentary I was reading this week, she made this great point. Talked about that how this prophet from this man of God from Judah, so faithful Judah, goes to warn unfaithful Israel about what's going on with their false worship. But they're not protected, right? They're not protected from making the same error that Israel did. And so this prophet who is deceived by this other prophet from Bethel is disobedient. And so if Judah is disobedient, it's almost this way of saying if Judah is disobedient, then they too are going to be judged. Just like this prophet who was disobedient to what God had told him to do. And he turned aside and he was deceived. And he died for it. He was judged. Judah too will be judged. And we see that play out. We know that is the end. They are going to fall to Babylon. Just not for a while. And then we get to chapter 14. And we have another prophet who prophesies against Jeroboam. And we learn that Jeroboam is going to, his reign is going to completely be at an end. There's no one from his family who is going to reign. And in fact, so he has his son is ill. And so Jeroboam sends his wife to go to Shiloh to Ahijah the prophet. And Ahijah's the one who told Jeroboam initially that he was going to be king. And so Ahijah is very old by this point. And his prophecy is that, Jeroboam's son is going to die. And he's going to die when you get back home. And not only that, but I'm going to bring disaster on the house. God is going to bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. He's going to cut off every last male and cut off from Jeroboam every last male in his line. He caused Israel to sin by making golden calves for them to worship and pulled them into false worship. And so she goes back and the son dies. The son is the only one who is buried and mourned properly. And then we're told just that Jeroboam's reign ended. It says where we can find out more information about it. The Annals of the Kings of Israel talks about how he reigned for 22 years and then rested with his ancestors. And it says Nadab, his son, succeeded him as king. And we'll have to pick up that story later on and see what happens. But then at that point in chapter 14, we get the back and forth. So we're going to see this as we read through 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to have stories about the northern kings, stories about the southern kings, and it kind of goes back and forth, not necessarily chapter by chapter or king by king, but there is a back and forth. We'll have times where we have stories from the northern kings, times where we have stories from the southern kings. And we get back to Rehoboam and get some information about his reign and find out that they definitely were also not faithful either. And it's really a short little passage here. And then it ends with the same kind of formula. As for the other events of Rehoboam's reign and all he did, they're written down in the annals of the kings of Judah. And there was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam rested with his ancestors and was buried with them in the city of David. And his mother's name was Naamah, and she was an Ammonite. And Abijah, his son, succeeded him as king. So you get this formula kind of that opens and closes these different kings. The first two are kind of different, but we'll see that as we go forward, there's more of a formula. Here's this king, and this is who they are, and then there's a closing formula of, and they ruled for this long, and they died, and they were buried, and all of the things about that. So, wow, what a crazy story. I really do love the stories in 1st and 2nd Kings, and it just reminds me of how messy everything is, and how God is with his people in the midst of the mess. Like, so he knew Solomon was going to do all the things he did, but yet he chose to consecrate the temple and be present with his people in the midst. And, you know, and I know we talked about that last week, but I just am reminded of it even more this week as we look at the messiness of Rehoboam and Jeroboam and all of the things that start happening in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and just how messy it was. But yet God is still God, and he still works in the midst of all of it. And we know from reading the prophets, and we know from just studying scripture throughout our lives that there's a faithful remnant. There's still people who don't lift their eyes to the idols. And we'll hear from the prophets. We'll meet Elijah and Elisha here in not too many chapters. And we'll keep hearing that God is still at work. God is still moving. He still desperately wants his people. He still desperately wants to have that relationship with his people. And that's what keeps coming through loud and clear for me as I've been reading this time through 1st and 2nd Kings. So I hope that you've taken the time to read, because we are definitely not going to cover every single verse as much as I would like to. But make sure you're reading these two books. They're fascinating, lots of stories, and very interesting stories, and weird stories, and fascinating stories. So I encourage you to read, and join me next week, and we'll keep talking. Bye!